I want to get to. So are you ready for that?
Hey, Dan, if you could, I know the stream's in the background. If you could mute that would be awesome.
Yep, just turned it off.
Cool. What's up, Dan?
What's up? I'm calling because I'd like to sort of delve into how we can have conversations with people and change their minds when it comes to what kind of media is trustworthy. And I'm coming at this from a perspective of, for example, I live in New York City, and a lot of people in my neck of the woods trust the New York Times, but I know a lot of people in other parts of the country trust Fox News.
Sure.
How do you... It's like, I feel like I trust experts, and the experts that I trust are people are, the journalists at the AP, New York Times, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If they have trust in something else, and it's not faith-based, it's not any of those other kinds of, personal experience, they're like looking to experts, but the Fox News people look like experts to them. What kind of like methods can we use to change minds, and how can I know that, Fox News isn't right about that kind of thing? If I'm, going to be honest about how I know what's true.
Yeah, Dan, that's an excellent question. And I got to say, I am also a subscriber of the New York Times. I am of the philosophy that you should pay for your news. If you want to get good news, you should pay for it. I think that's just a general rule people should follow. If you can, obviously. Now, New York Times is pretty cheap. It's like $4 a month, pretty cool. But I also like, the long form kind of journalism that they do, because I'm really interested in that kind of journalism, I guess, that kind of storytelling and reporting. So when it comes to talking about the trust that people put in different news sources, I think it's interesting. There's obviously going to be a ton of different factors as to why people orient themselves towards specific kinds of news. I think you'll find with a lot of cases, people will like, Fox News, for example, because they will already feel something about a topic, and then Fox News, for example, will put a headline out there that kind of, resonates with how they feel about something. And so if they can trust, oh, hey, that thing feels the same way I do, that's going to build trust. Right? Because we trust the people that think about things the same way that we do. Now, that has nothing to do with the actual truth value of the content of news that they produce. And of course, we can pick on Fox News, but this can be with any kind of news outlet. They all have their own individual markets and people that they're trying to target. And so they're going to cultivate an audience that way. So yeah, it is initially going to be based on feelings for a lot of people. Now, how do we convince people that, hey, some of this news isn't as good as other news? Well, for me, when I was first deconstructing this myself in some of my communication courses, I had a professor who had this assignment. And the assignment was every week we had to pull a news article from a news source that we liked and really break it down and, try to get as many other corroborating news sources as we could, figure out it was more about the story than the actual article itself, and figure out what we could gather from it. What did we learn from the reporting of these news? How did they differ from different sources? And what we concluded about the events at the end. And that was really eye-opening for me, because I realized, wow, yeah, some of these slants that can happen between different publications, they can be subtle, but subtle enough to change a whole narrative. First of all, we already know that most people aren't looking at entire stories; they're looking at headlines. But the kind of reporting we do and the language we use can totally change a perspective on things. So, I would ask, okay, what's a story that you've read from recently from Fox News? And if you have the time and this is somebody let's take a look at it together. Let's read that story and have discussions about the individual articles. Because if it's just headlines, not a lot you can do with that, right? Like, okay, that's a headline, here's a headline, whatever. But if we're going to look at the content of the information, that can, kind of make people more critical of the sources that they're looking at. And if you have that opportunity with somebody, I recommend you do that. If you don't have that kind of time with folks, it's going to be a lot harder, because, again, that's just a source that they're just going to trust and they're going to instinctively go to because it makes people feel good. And that's for myself as well. If I'm seeing something on social media, 90% of the time, if I see a headline, I'm not going to click it and read it, and that's bad. I want to try to disseminate as much information as I can and figure out the truth of stuff. But I also don't think I should be getting my news from social media anyway. That seems to be a problem for a lot of people, and seems to cause us some problems. But anyway, I've spoken a lot on this. I want to get Tom's take on this question.
Yeah, I actually think that the best way is street epistemology. Street epistemology offers a non-confrontational way in order to challenge ideas. So you essentially ask reflective questions. How did you come to that belief? How did you rule out this position? What led you to that? Those kinds of questions are really good to get people to articulate to themselves their justification for what it is that they're believing, and then they'll start to realize, oh, maybe that's not a real good justification. Like if the only reason they have to believe something is because it was said on Fox News, then when you ask them those follow-up questions and they don't have any real good answers, they're going to try to find those. And in their own research about trying to justify their own position, they'll actually start to find things that undermine it. And that is the best way to help change their level of reliability on a news source, is just to use that street epistemology of method of asking them questions and letting them research for themselves and find out that, oh, maybe this isn't the best justification.
Yeah, I agree. By the way, but if I feel like if I say street epistemology every single time, I sound like a broken record. But yeah, street epistemology is my preferred method as well. If we're talking about direct conversations on particular beliefs and what we feel about those beliefs. But go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you 100%. I mean, I've been following street epistemology for about 3 years now, and it's one of my favorite tools. And so this question sort of stems from the end of a theoretical street epistemology conversation, where if I'm honest with myself, let me imagine a situation where someone is doing street epistemology on me and asks me how I know that a certain news article that I read in the New York Times is reliable. There are, yes, you're right, something I could say, I've read this on multiple different news sources and they're all saying a similar thing. And so that's how I do it. But I'm not a journalist. I'm not looking into every single bit of data that they're referring to. I don't have the time to do that. I'm just a regular person. I have to have trust in
absolutely
some things. And so when I think about that kind of thing, if someone asks me, all these questions, how do you know? I'd be like, ultimately, I don't know 100%. I am putting trust into the New York Times because they seem the most trustworthy to me.
Yep.
And so it's sort of like I realize that that's a very similar answer to what Fox News is doing. I will say I try as much as possible to, like you say, like not just read the headlines, but look into it, see where they're citing their sources. If they are at all, if they're not citing their sources, then I immediately go, I don't know if this is true or not. I'm just going to say I don't know to this. But if they are citing sources, I can at least refute, this is from the Gallup poll, this is from Pew, this is from, this research, agency. But the problem comes is when there are people that are so down the rabbit hole of either it's conspiracy or whatever, and they think, the mainstream media, yes, of course the mainstream media all agrees, and you can find multiple news sources in different places around the web because it's the mainstream media.
They're all citing the AP, right? So, like, that's how it works. Like, yeah, of course. Yeah. Right.
So, I don't know. It's sort of like, I mean, we're on the same page here. I agree with you. I'm just sort of wondering, like, is there a rebuttal to the idea that the mainstream media, of course, all somewhat agrees, but I have the real truth.
Well, I could tell you like what my answer to that would be, and I can also tell you how I would approach it from a street epistemology thing. So, okay, maybe I'll try for both. So, like, my answer, if somebody were to say that to me and I was asked to give an answer, I would say, well, journalism requires specific processes to happen in order to be published through most media outlets. Like, journalists actually do follow a code of ethics, believe it or not. They have their own journalistic practices that they do, and allows them to continue working in the places that they do. And if you're not studied with that and you don't fully understand the mechanisms behind how that news actually gets created from start to finish, then I can see how the appearance of this news. And it's like, well, if you're starting from square one, if I didn't know anything about any of the news sources I was reading, I'd be confused too, right? Like, I wouldn't know who exactly to trust because you also have to build up experience with certain kinds of news sources to know what their leanings are going to be sometimes, or who the writers are, and what kind of positions they have on things. So it's a complicated thing, and yeah, I wish we all had the time to read the news all day and cite these sources and figure out stuff. But at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, we're people too. We have other stuff we got going on. So we have to trust some of the most reliable news that we can get and hope for the best on that. Now, if I'm going to talk on shows like this, I better be prepared. I better know what I'm talking about if I'm reading from stuff. But regardless, for the everyday life, right, for everyone else, it's not as good. So number 2 was, how would I approach this from a street epistemology point of view? If somebody were to challenge that to me, and I would have to think about this, I guess I would say, well, what sources of information do you find true personally? And what criteria did you use to figure out that information was reliable? You know, something starting from there. Figure out what people's own standards are. And, you know, they're going to tell you something, and you might think, yeah, that's not good. But you can't just say, yeah, that's not good, because that's going to shut it down, right? So it's like, okay, so like, you know, give some examples of how that system might be faulty, or maybe it can lead you to news that might be unreliable. And, you know, if there are example cases like this, like, well, how can we fix this? What are some other ways we can evaluate the news? Because, you know, most people don't have just one answer to this. You know, they're probably going to give you several ways of how they think about it. So I think that's a good start, at least. It's just kind of being a mirror and figuring out, like, hey, what's your standard of truth here? Is it everything that Alex Jones says is true because he's Alex Jones? Or, like, what's the starting point to all this? And again, I want to give the floor to
that's a good one. That's a good point.
Yeah, I want to give Tom a chance to answer this as well.
Well, my favorite tactic is actually to use whatever sources they like and then find parts of those sources that contradict. Like Fox News is a really great example, because you have people like Tucker Carlson, but then you also have Shep Smith. And if you actually research into what they say, they contradict a lot. So you could actually use Fox News to counter Fox News. And when you put the clips next to one another, it causes this cognitive dissonance into the listener, and they have to decide, well, which one of these people do I like more and which one do I trust more, and then go through the same process of, okay, so why should you believe what Tucker says as opposed to what Shep says? Because they trust Fox News. So how do they rationalize the different perspectives being articulated by these two different Fox hosts? And so if you take whatever sources they value and then find contradictory information that are used by that same source, you can create that cognitive dissonance and really make them think about how to process through that information and correct themselves on certain beliefs, to drop some and then adopt others.
That's a really good piece of advice. I think it's one of those ones where if you are good friends with someone and you can actually like convince them to have a longer conversation about it, then it works. But most of the time, it's short situations where no one has the patience for sitting down with you. But that's great. I mean, I didn't think about something like that.
I'll give you an example today, Dan. I was working with my boss. Gosh, I hope my boss doesn't see this. But my boss and I was having conversations, and he was like, he wanted to know some of my political views. And it's just like, oh, you really don't want to get into what I think about this guy's stuff, right? Because I kind of knew his background, and based on my background, it's like, yeah, we might not see things eye to eye. And, obviously two people can have a great conversation with each other, but the power dynamic's a little bit different when you're working for the guy. You know what I mean? So eventually I talked with him, and there were several things where I was just like, wow, that's totally different from what I think about stuff. Like one thing he was saying is like, yeah, I like to listen to Ben Shapiro a lot. That's I think he's really awesome and stuff. And I was just like, oh, well, like Ben Shapiro's not really my bag. I kind of have some problems with this position and this position and this position. And I think when I explained fully why I didn't agree with that stuff from my perspective, I think he understood. And then he kind of gave some things why he thought he really liked Ben. And it's like, oh, okay. He actually told me something. I was like, oh, that's a different way of thinking about things I hadn't heard before. So if somebody's asking you, I think that's a great start, because that means that they might be actually interested in what you have to say. And even if they aren't, you might be able to bring something up they hadn't thought of before. So whenever somebody is asking me questions when I'm having a street epistemology conversation, I see that as a really good sign. Because that means they're interested. So I don't know if that helps you, Dan. I hope your conversations with your friends and other people goes well. And I hope that, hey, you can find the truth just like the rest of us. So thanks again for calling. Really appreciate it. What a fantastic call. And I hope to hear from you again. Yeah.